This video covers creating our initial networking configuration. Now the first step is to make sure I disable creating logical networks automatically. So by default this box is checked and I've gone ahead and unchecked it. I don't want VMM to automatically create logical networks based on Hyper-V hosts I may add. Click OK to that. If I go to my fabric, I can see I created two host groups. I'm not managing any hosts yet, but I created a Dallas and Houston. I'm going to go down to my logical networks, and I'm going to go ahead and create a logical network. Now I want networks for my corp, my lab, and then network virtualization. I'm going to create corp first. It's one connected network. I'm not using network virtualization on this corp network. I can then add sites. And I can say this is actually applicable to all hosts. I'm going to insert a VLAN of 10, which is what my corp uses, but I'm not entering an IP subnet because I've got DHCP servers. I would only populate this if I actually have to limit it to a certain IP subnet and I want to create IP pools within VMM. I'm going to rename the site name to actually corp trunk, because this is kind of my trunk for the entire corporation. Hit next. I can click view script to actually view the code that it's using to go ahead and create this site. Close that, hit finish to go ahead and create that one. Now I'm going to go and repeat this and create my lab network. So I'm going to create logical network again. I call it my lab. Give it a description, lab networks. This time my lab is using VLANs, really the independent networks. So I'm going to select the VLAN based independent network option. And the way this actually works in my environment is each of my different VLANs would actually be considered a different site. Now, all of them are actually based in Dallas for right now. So I'm just going to focus on Dallas. I'm going to insert a row. And so, for example, I might say VLAN 173, and that is IP subnet 10.7.173.0/24. And my network site name maybe would be lab 173. I would then add another site. Once again, this is going to be Dallas. And this time I'll add this for VLAN 174. Now I have lots of these, but just for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and add in two of them. And I would call this lab 174. So I've got two sites, which represent my two VLANs. Again, I could view my script. I'll save this as VMM lab logical network create. Click finish. Now with this one, because I've actually entered an IP subnet, I actually want to create IP pools as well, which are IP addresses available to VMM to allocate to virtual machines when it creates them. So this one I'm going to say create an IP pool. And I'm going to call this lab 173 IPs. And I could give it a description of actually what it's being used for. I'll just give it the same description. Logical network is lab. Now it's going to ask me for which site. So I'm going to say use existing network site 173, VLAN 173. Now it's going to ask me for those IP details. Now remember, these are the details available to VMM. So which addresses do I want VMM to be able to give out? So I don't want to give it the whole range because I actually have other servers allocating IP addresses. But I'm going to give it 50 addresses. And also I might want to use virtual IP addresses for load balancers. So I'm going to carve out just 5 addresses that could actually be used for virtual IPs, for load balancers. And because this is effectively now acting kind of like a DHCP server, I also have to give it other information. So I have to tell it, well, what is the gateway? So for this network, it's .1. I have to tell it who the DNS servers are for that network. I enter the primary. So this will all look very, very familiar. This is really all the same things you have to define if you're defining a DHCP scope. And I can save this as well, just so we get the idea of exactly what we're doing if you wanted to automate this in the future. And again, in the book, I give you a different script to actually do this. I'm just going to save these little bits off as we create them. Finish. So that's going to create me one IP pool for the 173. Now I want to go ahead and again, I can do create IP pool from here. This is going to be lab 174 IPs. I'm going to give it the same one, same description. Using existing, this time I'm going to use site 174. You can see it knows the IP subnet changes. Again, I'm going to use that same set of IP addresses, just this time it's in the 174 range. And again, I'm going to carve out just 5 addresses if I want to create any virtual IPs load balancers in the future. Its gateway, once again, would be the 10.174, this time .1. And the way the labs work, the DNS server is always the .10, it's the DC. And we'll pretend it's still saviltech.net for now. And finish. So now what I have is I have my 2 IP pools as well that I can actually go ahead and allocate IP addresses to virtual machines that I actually go and create. Now the last network I need to create is a virtualization network. So I'm going to create logical network. And this is going to be my Hyper-V network virtualization. And this is kind of my PA space. So let's call it PA. I could give it the same description as well. So it's one connected network. This time I'm going to allow VM networks created on this to actually use network virtualization. Going to go ahead and add a site. And again, I'm just going to do all of this in Dallas. And what I have to do this time, I have to add an IP subnet because this is my space that I'm going to use actually for the Hyper-V hosts to get their provider addresses. Now for the VLAN in the network I'm going to focus on right now is actually 173 as well. But this would obviously differ in your environment. And I'm actually going to set the subnet for these ones to be 172.1.1.0. And I'll just call that network site Hyper-V PA. Actually, I'll call it _0. You never know, in the future I may want to add additional ones. I can view my script. Again, I'm going to save it as usual. Go ahead and create that. And because this is actually going to allocate IP addresses to the hosts, I definitely need to create an IP pool on this one. So this is going to be my Hyper-V network virtualization IPs. My Hyper-V network site. IP address range. Actually, this time it can use all of them. I won't be creating virtual IPs. I only need a gateway if I'm going to cross subnets, which in my environment I won't be for this test. I don't need DNS servers. I don't need anything else. So I'll just save this as well. Now I'm ready. Now I actually have the logical networks all set up in my environment. Now one of the options I had while creating these was to automatically create a virtual network. But I didn't do that for any of these environments. But I'm now going to jump over to my VMs and services because this is a concept directly related to virtual machines. Go to my VM networks. I'm going to actually go ahead and say create VM network. And I'm just going to create a VM network for the logical networks I want to make available. So for example, I might go ahead and create a Corp logical network. You can see it's selected Corp. I could view the script. So this is creating my PMM Corp VM network. Create. You know, there's not really many settings to put in. The only time we have to put in a lot of information for this is when we use network virtualization, because then we can actually go ahead and define different IP schemes related to the actual virtual networks we're creating. And also go ahead and create, I don't want to do network, that's going to be a separate video. I'm going to go ahead and run for my lab. Actually, I'm going to create this lab 173. And this is going to be for the 173 virtual network. Again, you can view our script. Save this off. Finish. And then I'm going to create one for lab 174 as well. And you'll notice I can only have one VM network. So it's not actually giving me the option for 173 anymore because it's already been allocated to a VM network. So now as I created VMs and I attached it to these different VM networks, it would know to actually go and map through to the corresponding logical network. So we've modeled the physical networks with logical networks. We've now created VM networks. And the next thing I now want to actually do is go and create some port profiles and a logical switch, which I can actually use for hosts. Now, as part of the standard VMM, I have a number of port profiles. And these are really different configurations of the types of traffic you may have. So I've got, for example, cluster. And it's using VMQ, IPsec. I can do different security settings, bandwidth priorities, minimum bandwidth weight, guessed if it's a dynamic IP. See, it allows guest specified IP addresses. So these are specific configurations that it's actually going to make to those virtual network adapters that use these. So these are configurations that will get applied to network adapters creating either on virtual machines or even on the management partition, i.e. the Hyper-V host. We also have these port classifications, and these are really just logical names. I'm actually going to talk about those in a bit more detail later. But essentially, think of the storage, either gold tier of storage, a silver tier of storage, or bronze. These are exactly the same things, really. And the way this works is I might have different port profiles, different configurations in different environments. But I just want to say, well, this is considered a high bandwidth connection. This is considered a medium bandwidth connection. And that may mean different things to different locations. But typically, high bandwidth will mean the high bandwidth adapter port profile. So it's actually not as complicated as it actually seems. Now we get a lot of these by default, but there were two types of port profile. That's the virtual one. There's also an uplink port profile. And an uplink port profile is saying which logical networks can be connected to via this port. Now in my case, I'm really only going to have one type of connection. My switches are all configured with all of those different VLANs, so it's really just a trunk port. Now this uplink port profile What this is saying is, suppose I actually go ahead and when I'm assigning this logical switch I'm going to create to a host, I select 3, 4, 5, 2 network adapters. I want it to automatically go and configure NIC teaming for me. And I'm going to use the dynamic mode. And the way I want this is switch independent. And now what I'm saying is, well, what are all the networks that be connected to via this specific uplink? And for me, it's all of them. And I'm also going to say, yes, I can use network virtualization because obviously I'm using it on this one over here. And I would then go ahead and save this again. This is my VMM trunk uplink. If I can spell port profile. Go ahead and create that. So then I'll see a new one appear of type uplink. So I now have my logical, my VM networks, my port profiles, my uplink. All that's really left now is to actually create a logical switch. So I go to my logical switch. I'm going to go ahead and say create logical switch. And there's quite a lot of options for this. So this is telling me, hey, before I do this, make sure you've created your logical networks, define the sites. If you're using Hyper-V switch extensions, make sure you've installed those into VMM. If I'm using forwarding extensions, make sure I've enabled them. Create those port profiles for different virtual adapters. So I've done all of that. So I can now go ahead and give this a name. So I'm going to call this my data center switch. So SRIOV is something you have to configure at the time of creation. So I do not want to use SRIOV. Again, later in the book, different sections, I'm going to talk about this. But for now, this will not support SRIOV. You don't want to enable this unless you specifically know you're going to need it. Because it does disable some things for the entire switch, some quality of service, for example, settings. So I'm going to say no to that. If I had additional extensions to the switch installed, I could say which ones I want to get enabled on the host that use this switch. So I'm just going to have the default Windows filtering. What uplink am I actually going to use for this? So my default is no uplink team, but I'm actually going to add in my trunk port, and I want to change this to team. So this is that idea that if I am selecting multiple network adapters, it will actually create a NIC team based on those settings that I configured as part of the port profile. And then I can actually go ahead and say, well, what classifications are available for the various ports in this switch? So I'm going to say, I'm going to support high bandwidth. And what that means, if that's selected, is the high bandwidth adapter. I'm also going to say I'm going to support medium bandwidth. And what does that mean? Is the medium bandwidth. Now, I'm not using this for the management OS. If I was, I would also add things like the cluster, for example, live migration. And I'm going to say high bandwidth is my default. So these are the different classifications I'm going to be able to assign to specific adapters that I create through this. So I can save this. VMM create logical switch. And go ahead and create that. So now I have a switch as well. So at this point, I'm actually ready to go ahead and assign this. Now the first thing I'm actually going to do is add some hosts. So if I go to my hosts, I currently don't have any. What I have configured is a run as account for, so I'm going to go in, say create run as account. Let's say domain admin. Administrator, give it the password. Now you'd normally have a different account. This is just my lab environment, so I'm actually not too worried. So I have a domain admin, and I'm going to go ahead and add in some Hyper-V hosts in Dallas. It's in a trusted domain. I'm going to use my domain admin, run as account I just added. I discover it by name, Sabdal Hyper-V 20, Sabdal Hyper-V 21. It actually found they were part of a cluster, so I'm going to add in that entire cluster into here, add it to my Dallas host group. I can go ahead and view this script. I'm going to save this. VMM add hosts, Hyper-V. So what it's actually going to do is go and talk to those hosts, install the VMM agent, make the service a local admin on that machine. I went ahead and I enabled the SMBin file services so I can actually go and connect to them. Admin remote management was already enabled because it's a 2012 R2 box, and 2012 and above actually has that already. So then this will just go and run. So is that going to go ahead? I can actually go and check on the status in the jobs to see the details of what it's doing. So I can actually see now it's going ahead installing the agent, deploying the host, and it will refresh, then refresh the entire cluster. So this is just taking a little bit of time on each box. It looks like it's working well. If Hyper-V wasn't enabled, it would actually go and install the Hyper-V role and actually enable it on the box as well. Any switch port settings required, and we should be good to go. So I can see it's now adding. And at this point, once I have these boxes, the only thing I wanted left to demonstrate was actually deploying this switch to these boxes. So if I look at the box directly, what I currently have is, if I look at my network adapters, and this is the same on both boxes, they're identical. I have 3 NICs that I want to put into a NIC team. And in Hyper-V, I currently have no virtual switches defined. So if I go into Virtual Switch Manager, I don't have any. And what I'm looking to do is on both of these boxes, again, I'll just show you the other one as well. I want them to become a team. Let's jump over. So that's completed. And they're now being read in terms of the information on them, and I can now manage them. So at this point, I want to deploy that logical switch to this box. So I'm going to connect on one of my boxes. I look at my properties. And I can see here sort of virtual switches tab. And I can also, on the hardware, I can see the different equipment, the network adapters, and currently they're all sort of unknown in terms of switch port detection. There's no logical networks. So I'm going to go ahead and go to virtual switch. I'm going to create a new virtual switch, and it's a new logical switch. I could also create a standard switch, which is just a native Hyper-V, no VMM config, but I actually want to do a logical switch. It's going to be my data center switch. And I want to add 3 network adapters. 1, 2, and 3. Now, for Hyper-V, it's always going to use the same uplink port profile in a team. But there are some types of forwarding extensions that allow different types of uplink for the different adapters in a team. But I can't do that. So I'm now ready to go ahead and create it. Now, if this was using network adapters that were also maybe being used for my management, I could go ahead and add a new virtual adapter. I could give it a name. Maybe I would have enabled a port classification of management. Remember, I didn't do that because I'm not using it for this. And what it would actually do is from the first NIC in the team, it would copy the MAC and IP address into this new management level network adapter. So I wouldn't lose connectivity, but I don't actually want to do that. So those 3 NICs, Click OK. Do you want to continue? And again, I could view the script of the changes it's about to make. So I'm just going to save this one off. So notice every single thing I do, it gives me the PowerShell. So I can do it in a GUI once, and I don't need to do anything else. I can then automate everything. So it's going to go through. I can look at the jobs again. It's now changing the properties of that VM. And what I'll see if I go and look at it is on the network adapter side, I should see a new one created. It says that switch. So it's created that for me. And if I look at the actual NICs, I'll see they're unattached to everything, unbinded from everything except teaming. And I can even now look at this in Server Manager, and I'll now see that team has actually been created. So it's there. And it's still getting configured up. So it's currently giving me a warning, but I'm not actually worried about it. See, it's failed connection. They'll come back in a second. It's still detecting some stuff. But it went ahead and created that team. VM now shows it completed. Now, completed with info. And the reason is it's saying this is not highly available because the switch is not available on the other host in the cluster. Remember, these are clustered. And so it's saying, well, the switch is only on one of them. So next thing I would do on my other box, I will repeat the process exactly the same. Go to my switches, new virtual switch, logical, data center, add my 3 NICs. 1, 2, 3. Using that trunk port is the only profile I have. Okay. And this time that one will run as well, the job, but it won't complete with info because it knows the other host in the cluster already has that switch. So there's now no problem in terms of configuration on one box and not the other. If I look on the other box, I'll see exactly the same thing again. It will actually now have gone and created a NIC team. And again, it's still going through the config of the team. It's giving me the same thing. If I look at my other one, hopefully it's not still in error. Yep, so now that one's good to go. It's quite happy. I'm not sure why it's showing 100. They should all be 1 gig. I have to go and double check that. And now this one is all active as well. If I look in Hyper-V Manager, I should now see a switch has been created. It's using that team. It's not shown with the management OS. And the extension are the ones I selected, and the VMM DHCP extension. But effectively in this half an hour, we completely configured networking. We didn't do network virtualization. That's going to be a separate exercise. We added hosts. We deployed configuration to them, along with a NIC team, actually very, very simply. So this concludes the video on network configuration using Virtual Machine Manager.